I didn't scream. I didn't confront him. When I discovered my husband's betrayal, I stayed quiet, and that silence changed everything. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the truth is allowed to speak for itself. 12 years. That's how long we were married when everything unraveled. 12 years of building something I thought was real, something I thought mattered. David was the kind of husband other women envied. Thoughtful, reliable, the type who remembered anniversaries and brought flowers home for no reason. He coached Little League on weekends, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, always knew exactly what to say at dinner parties. Everyone loved David. I loved David. From the outside, we looked solid. Inside, something felt quietly wrong. It wasn't anything I could point to at first, just this distance, like we were playing house instead of living in one. He'd come home from work and we'd talk about our days, but it felt scripted somehow, rehearsed. I started noticing how he'd check his phone constantly, even during conversations. How he'd shower immediately after walking through the door, before even saying hello properly. How his laugh sounded different when he was on work calls, more animated, more alive than anything I heard anymore. The gut feelings started small. A cologne I didn't recognize on his shirts. Meetings that ran late more frequently than they ever had before. The way he'd turn his phone face down when we were eating dinner, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 12 years of marriage had made me oversensitive to changes that probably meant nothing. I had questions, but I wasn't ready for answers yet. Then came the night I couldn't ignore it anymore. David was in the shower, and his phone kept buzzing on the nightstand. Text after text. I wasn't the type to snoop. I'd always respected his privacy, trusted him completely. But something about the frequency, the persistence of those messages, made my stomach twist. I picked up the phone. Her name was Sarah. The messages were explicit, loving, recent, very recent. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through weeks of conversations, weeks of plans I knew nothing about, weeks of a life my husband was living without me. There were photos, there were promises, there were conversations about me that made my skin crawl. The shower was still running. David was humming some song I didn't recognize, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire double life was glowing in my hands. I could have burst into the bathroom right then, could have thrown the phone at him, screamed, demanded explanations. Instead, I set the phone back down exactly where I'd found it and walked downstairs to the kitchen. I realized confronting him would only give him time to prepare. Something cold and calculating took over. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was self-preservation, but I knew that giving him warning would only result in more lies, more careful cover-ups, more manipulation. So I said nothing. When he came downstairs 20 minutes later, hair still damp, I was making coffee like it was any other evening. He kissed my forehead and asked about my day. I told him about the meeting I'd had with a difficult client, and he listened with what looked like genuine concern. The next few weeks were the strangest of my life. I watched my husband with new eyes, cataloging every lie as it left his mouth. He was so careless once he believed he was safe. Phone calls that were supposedly from his brother, but where he used a voice I'd never heard before. Weekend work trips that didn't align with his company calendar, which I had access to through our shared email account. Late nights at the office that happened to coincide with Sarah's own schedule, which I could track through her very public social media presence. When someone believes they're safe, they reveal who they truly are. David became sloppy, reckless even. He'd come home smelling like her perfume and not even shower before climbing into bed next to me. He'd get text messages during dinner and smile at his phone with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in years. He started picking fights over nothing. The way I loaded the dishwasher, my choice of restaurant for date night, my decision to visit my sister for the weekend. I realized later he was trying to create distance, trying to justify what he was doing by painting me as difficult, unreasonable. The lies stacked on top of each other until they became architectural, a whole structure of deception that required constant maintenance. I watched him work to keep it all straight, watched him get frustrated when details didn't line up. He'd tell me he was staying late for a project, then come home talking about a different project entirely. He'd say he was going to the gym, but come back without the distinct exhaustion that actually working out brings. I started documenting everything, not for legal purposes, not yet, but because I needed to know the scope of what I was dealing with. Screenshots of his location data, copies of credit card statements showing charges at restaurants I'd never been to. A growing file of evidence that painted a picture I could no longer deny. 3 months into my silent observation, everything started unraveling on its own. Sarah's husband found out. David didn't know that I knew this, but Sarah's public social media made it obvious when her life imploded. Suddenly, David's late nights stopped. His phone calls became hurried, anxious. He started drinking more, sleeping less. The confident, careless version of my cheating husband disappeared, replaced by someone jumpy and paranoid. By the time he tried to explain, the truth had already spoken for him. The night he finally confessed was almost anticlimactic. We were watching television, some mindless show neither of us cared about, when his phone rang. Sarah's husband. David looked at the caller ID and went pale. He declined the call, but it rang again immediately. And again. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. I turned off the television and looked at him, really looked at him. This man I'd shared 12 years with, who I'd trusted with my future, my dreams, my body, my heart. He looked like a stranger. He told me about Sarah, about the affair that had been going on for 8 months, about how it started as friendship and became something else, about how he'd never meant for it to happen, how he'd tried to end it multiple times, how he was sorry, so incredibly sorry, and how he'd do anything to fix this. I listened to every word without interrupting. When he finished, he looked at me with desperate hope, like my silence meant forgiveness was possible. "I know," I said finally. "I've known for months." The confusion that crossed, his face was almost comical. Then came the fear as he realized what my silence had meant, what it had cost him. While he'd been careful around Sarah's husband, he'd been completely careless around me. I knew everything, every lie, every manipulation, every moment he'd looked me in the eye and chosen deception. I didn't need to destroy anything. His choices did that on their own. Looking back now, I understand that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was protection. It was giving truth the space it needed to emerge naturally, without my anger or my pain contaminating the clarity of what had actually happened. Some people think patience is passive, but I learned it can be the most powerful action you can take. Truth doesn't need help. It just needs time. If you appreciate stories where patience leads to clarity and life lessons reveal themselves, consider subscribing.